Good evening. Thank you for being here. Tonight's daily discourse is on distraction. Forgive me for having these very dense topics and trying to be thorough in a 15-minute discourse. I apologize if it can be hard to follow or just too dense. Let me know and we could break them apart, as we'll do with this one, if that's easier. To preface, there's something to be learned in all things. This is the nature of God, so take this as you will. Today will be about distraction. Tomorrow, self-discipline. The two are very closely related, and there will be elements of each intertwined. To start, think about childhood, or think about a child. A child, in a sense, is bound under obedience to their parents or guardians or teachers or adults in general. And so the child says, "Mom, can I have candy for dinner?" No. End of story. Or the child might ask, "Why not?" And because I said so. Because it isn't good for you to have candy for dinner. And that's that. Even if the child has a tantrum or becomes upset, it does not hopefully change the fact that you cannot have candy for dinner. Then, arbitrarily, children become adults, but many grown-ups become grown-up children, or children in adult bodies. Can I have candy for dinner? Well, I suppose you could, and no one may stop you, but it does not change that it's probably not a good idea. Without a proper moral development, and also then a self-discipline to adhere to, but again, that will be for tomorrow. Many children end up staying as children. It's not to say childlike, but children in the sense that they go from one thing to the next without any sort of moral guidelines, following instead the guidance of desires. Many people get stuck in this cycle of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, which is normal to some extent. However, in the way much of our culture is set up, it's rather easy to get caught in this kind of self-satisfying cycle of living. Hungry, you can have candy for dinner, or order any food you want from your phone and it shows up right away. If you're lonely, you turn to texting people that perhaps you don't really care for, just trying to avoid any kind of uncomfortable feelings. If you're angry, you can say whatever you want to whomever you want on the internet. If you're bored, there are countless mindless ways to be entertained. In that line of thinking, right, we seek the reaffirmation of others in this overwhelming way. And when that isn't satisfied, we consider how else to meet that want or to look for an immediate means of distraction. So you can see kind of where this road that we're on now is going to fork at this point, and we'll discuss self-discipline next time, but it parallels distraction very closely. Discourses in the past have kind of set a pretty decent foundation of the importance of meditation, prayer, and communication with God, so I won't go into that right now. But thinking then, why don't we meditate or pray or partake in regular holy reading or just simply sit quietly in stillness or in contemplation? Why is there this drastic imbalance in how our time is spent? Again, I by no means am trying to tell people what to do or how to spend their time, nor judge the lives of others. I'm just simply expressing that if you're feeling lost or if you're feeling stuck, there is another way. And in some regard, that way is in opposition to the way that culture is set up. So if you have candy for dinner, which you're perhaps better off without candy at all, but if you do have candy for dinner, it should be on very rare occasions. But it's more immediately satisfying than cooking a simple meal probably, or it's easier than cooking and doing dishes. It's more convenient. And so the rare occasion of having candy for dinner, right, it becomes once in a while, which becomes more and more frequently, which becomes a majority of the time. And so we see how quickly these habits can develop. Looking at candy, right, it's empty of nutrition, and in fact, it's doing more harm in the long run to you. And so whereas eating in a simple way that is healthful, health promoting, is perhaps better for you in the long run. So this sacrifice moment to moment has a better long-term effect. Again, something we'll get into more with the idea of self-discipline, but just to kind of lay this framework out, because you can see where this perspective then, it just kind of naturally develops, where each time you do not eat something that is good for you, you are then choosing to eat something that is less beneficial in order to satisfy this immediate want and this immediate need and this convenience. And that's how that pattern kind of builds and builds and builds. And life then, when you start to see it this way, though, it becomes this series of choices on whether or not we eat this metaphorical candy. The same is true for the activities throughout the day then. If we can understand that, we transfer it to the day. And the more focus on, self-discipline we'll deal with tomorrow. So let me preface this again by saying, with humility, I'm not trying to criticize how people eat or how people spend their time, just really acknowledging things as they are, objectively. And in this case, let's refer to the level of external stimulation that we constantly are consciously and maybe unconsciously subjected to day in and day out. Some of it by choice, some of it unavoidable to a degree. So if we separate that then and speak towards basically strictly talking about leisure time, and let's include a daily commute as leisure time as well. Although you shouldn't be texting and driving, but we look at leisure time and we fill it with smartphone games, social applications, music, movies, conversations of questionable agendas. And at the end of the day, the mind has just been constantly working and working and working to process everything, and it has no time to rest, right? Even simply commuting and listening to music, your mind has to process everything going on, and also this stimulation of sounds. And so as a society as a whole, it seems like we're running from something in this avoidance of stillness, this avoidance of simplification. We're constantly checking emails, getting notifications, seeking approval and affirmation from friends and peers and otherwise. We jump from one distraction to the next. Okay, so if we look at this now more closely, right, breaking apart further our leisure time, most of these actions are pleasure seeking in a quest for lust or to boost our pride and our ego or to satisfy this presumed need for social approval. If it's not that, then it's avoiding something, whether it's feeling lonely or bored or sad or not worthwhile. Small tangent, but in a way, this cycle just loops and loops. And the way it's all designed, we show people what we want them to see. We boost our wonderful qualities that we want the world to know. We flaunt our lifestyles, all to seek the approval of others so that we can feel satisfied. But like we spoke of in the past, and as scripture tells us, right, the house built upon the sand, it's not long lasting. It would be quickly washed away once the foundations are shaken. And once our way of life is challenged, this artificial, superficial way of life that we present to the world, once it becomes challenged, everything crumbles down and there's nothing left. And this can be scary, so we do what we can to defend these things that we build up, this ego and this pride. And because everything is designed in such a way, we're in constant comparison to others, forming jealousy and prideful anger. And again, boosting our egos and sort of satisfying this need and want of other people. It's a cycle that maybe must be broken, and simply acknowledging when we're distracting ourselves. And distracting is an umbrella over the idea of fulfilling some other thing that we think that we need, right? So we're distracting ourselves with dating apps. We're distracting ourselves with social media things. We're distracting ourselves so we don't feel lonely. We're distracting ourselves so we don't feel bored. We're distracting ourselves so we don't feel that because we're not meeting this standard that's been falsely set, that we're not worthwhile. So it's this constant cycle, this constant merry-go-round. And again, simply knowing that we're distracting ourselves. It's a wonderful way to stop the merry-go-round, or at least acknowledge it and eventually get off. The more that we can choose distraction, the more we need distracting. That's this cycle. However, the simpler we can make our lives and ourselves, the more space there is for building a true happiness. This is most important, to refocus our lives, to seek the love of God and the approval of God. Not necessarily that we need God's approval, but that we want to please God. It has this sort of refining effect on us that forces us down this path of a truer happiness. Again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But this love is freely given to us at all times. But let's not get distracted. So from that tangent, we come back, choosing not to follow every pleasure-seeking urge that happens to us, everything that comes to mind, choosing to break it, even just at the simplest thing, not to pull the phone out, right? It helps to break the cycle longer term. It can be applied to and then translated to many other parts of our being, many other parts of our day. The very basis of this, again, is to first acknowledge the elements of our lives as they are. For many, taking out the phone, opening an app is an act that has become muscle memory. This incessant checking emails is the same way. It holds this expectation, excitement, and it just becomes this thing that we do without thinking. It holds our attention just long enough to make it this kind of continuing and repetitious behavior. So it's important then to put the label on it as a distraction. And again, the same with music, with radio, with television, and with movies. I don't intend to speak to the value one may or may not find in these things, but simply to speak to them as they are, which is external stimulation. All values aside, they're external stimulation. And the bigger part of this is to reset this balance in our lives. Because the more that these activities are chosen, the more they become what we consider normal. And generally then, there is this imbalance on how we spend our time. The act of just sitting, the simple act of sitting down, or holy readings, reading from any sort of scripture, or meditating, or praying, or some sort of creative activity, any kind of engagement in that. When we choose these instead, we slowly rework our brains. And as mentioned in other discourses, there's this innate understanding of stillness. It's completely relatable. It's the reason why a sunset is so beautiful and so peaceful, because the idea of peace already rests within us. And seeing something like the sunset reminds us that it's there. However, the idea, right, that this state can be, the state of peace can be accessed at any time, it seems so distant because of this big imbalance that we have. In order, right, to be able to understand this, it's necessary to begin to restructure life accordingly. So again, small breaks from this constant stream of distractions throughout the day, it can be very helpful in establishing this, especially looking at it more longer term. To go a bit further then, when the meditative practice begins to transform our internal workings, right, a sincere gratitude and appreciation is developed within. And this can be an emotional experience, but has a very powerful effect on how we view every day, because it can alter our perspective of time, right? Tomorrow is no longer taken for granted. Every day and every moment is seen as this precious, precious gift. We presume tomorrow is a given, but never to take a day for granted, never a moment for granted. We must begin to view life this way in order to allow our views on distraction be transformed. When a true appreciation for today exists, how could we consciously choose to spend time so loosely, thinking that we have this abundance of it? But we don't know. And so really precious, see what we have as precious, and really treasure it and see it as it is. More on that in another talk, but to mention it now, it's important. And when we live with this gratitude towards God, which is humility, we're choosing to do the opposite of the distracting ways, right? It goes back to this, it's one or the other. Can't necessarily be both. I understand that this is being set up like this strict, regimented thing, and I don't mean to come across that way. More practically speaking, there's a story from St. Anthony where he's out in the forest with several of his disciples or other monks that studied under him, and they are having a joyous time. And this hunter sees them, and the hunter disapproves of how they're spending their time, and he addresses St. Anthony and makes that clear. And St. Anthony says to the hunter, who has a bow, he says, "Take your bow and pull it." And the hunter does it. And St. Anthony says, "Pull it some more, and some more, and some more." And the hunter says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, if I keep pulling it, I'm going to break my bow." And St. Anthony says, "And so with us, if we stay focused and focused and focused on this without any sort of break from it, we too will break in spirit." The story goes something like that. Don't quote me on it, but the idea being that yes, like leisure time is important, but how much time are we spending in a way that maybe is distracting, is fulfilling a need for this emptiness, fulfilling these empty qualities when it can be reset otherwise. So perhaps, right, the goal of this discourse is part of a bigger picture of simplifying life in order to reset these scales and to achieve a greater internal balance, to see our desires as they are and acknowledge them and learn not to act towards satisfying them constantly, to choose simplicity and stillness over the unnecessary noise that maybe social media and television can provide. Maybe a big fast from all of these things can help. You see, if you make a conscious choice not to partake in unnecessary stimulation, then it's easier to stay true to this. It's important to understand where our impulsive nature is and how it has a tendency to control actions and thus our emotional states. If we refocus on God and things beyond ourselves and our pleasures and our emotions, the pace of life naturally changes. Someone wiser than myself once said that we cannot make our happiness in this life our top priority. It's important, but we must live for eternity first and foremost. Implied in all this is the changing of who we are inside, decluttering our hearts of selfishness. This transformation is difficult, but it brings a much more lasting happiness in this lifetime. I know that was a whole lot and rather dense, I said from the start, so please forgive me. And not to take you on this journey and then abandon you at conceptual crossroads. Lord willing, the next discourse will address self-discipline and give a more tangible and practical understanding and application of all of this. Not just to give theory on things, but to give a guidebook, a practical application to it. So more on that next time. But please, as always, never hesitate to ask any questions. I can respond to the very best of my ability. Or if there's a topic that you'd like addressed, please let me know. Otherwise, as always, thank you for listening. And Lord willing, tomorrow, 7 p.m., we'll continue from there. Thank you.